It's been 150 years since the Great Chicago Fire, but some of the details are still up for debate. CBS 2's Jim Williams spoke with Newberry Library's Paul Durica for some clarity.
There's still some debate over what started the Great Chicago Fire. A lot of Chicagoans believe that it was a cow in the barn of Mrs. Catherine O'Leary that kicked over a lantern, and that led to the greatest disaster in the city's history. And a curious thing is that you begin to see Catherine O'Leary and her cow appear in the story very early on. Just a couple weeks after the fire, they're already beginning to investigate, and she's being asked to give testimony, as is her husband. But a lot of historians today don't think that the Learys were responsible. In their own testimony, they say that they were already in bed by the time the fire started.
Yeah.
All we know for sure is that it began somewhere in that part of town around about 8:30 at night on the evening of October 8th, and very quickly spread north and east.
Paul, how widespread was the disaster?
It was big. So it basically started at roughly what is kind of like Roosevelt today and a little bit west of the river. And then it like jumped the river once and then spread north and east, basically taking out, most of the city between the lake and the river and as far north as what is Fullerton today. But what a lot of Chicagoans don't realize is that even in 1871, the city was a lot bigger than that. So the city's western boundary extended as far west as Pulaski today and as far south as Pershing or 39th today. So the south and west sides were actually largely unimpacted by the fire.
There was this immediate response to the fire from around the world, right? People from all over the world, in part because of sympathy, but also with an acknowledgement that Chicago was important to the world's economy by that point, 1871, right, Paul?
That's right. I mean, Chicago was already becoming, a major transportation hub and a major center of like commerce and manufacturing. And one of the reasons that Chicago was able to rebuild so quickly, and it did, is because of its location. So, people were still able to get goods in through the lake, and then the railroad network was left largely intact after the fire. So people were still able to get materials and supplies into the city. And you're right, like people were very, very generous. All the surrounding cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, sent things to Chicago to help Chicagoans, but also relief came from around the world. So Great Britain, England, for example, donated a lot of books that provide the basis for the Chicago Public Library.
And was it more than just the regional the importance to the regional economy or even the national economy? It's my understanding Chicago was important to the world's economy because of trade with other countries, right?
Yes, very much so. I mean, Chicago at that point in time was, helping to provide grain, right, to the whole country. Like farmers would send their products into Chicago, they'd get refined here and get sent out. It was providing lumber, right? So, we've got a lot of forests to the north in Michigan and Wisconsin, that wood's being cut down, sent to Chicago, where it was in lumber yards here, and then sent, east and west so people could build their homes. And then, as you said, yeah, it was part of these global global trade as well. So when Chicago was first burned down and the impact seemed like it was going to be huge and ripple out, the response was so quick and so decisive in helping the city rebuild that, within a couple of years, Chicago was mostly recovered and certainly was completely rebuilt by the time of the World's Fair in 1893.
Yeah. What are the lessons that we learned?
The fire does have a lot to teach us about where we are today. So, I said we still don't know quite what caused it. It was most likely not Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern, although it's possible. But what we do know is that had been like a long, hot, dry summer. And there had been other fires leading up to the Great Chicago Fire. And the city didn't have enough resources to combat these fires. The fire department was still relatively small at that time. And, a good portion of the city was made out of wood. So it was like prime for this disaster to unfold. And I mentioned too that the fire jumped the river. And that's partially because, there were a lot of boats and things on the river that, sparks could catch fire and then it could jump. But also the river was really polluted because of all the industry. Mm-hmm. So, the lessons that we have is that, these disasters, they're kind of slow to build, but then they can happen suddenly and cause widespread devastation. And so we always need to be kind of thinking about these things and be prepared.
Yeah. Is there a lesson to be learned as we try to emerge from the pandemic. The pandemic has had such an enormous economic impact, devastation in Chicago and elsewhere. Is there a parallel? The city was able to rebuild quickly. What can we learn from that, and can it be connected to this post-pandemic world that we're trying to enter?
Yes, and in the sense that, when you read personal accounts of how people responded to the fire, both in the moment and afterwards, there was a real sort of sense of shared purpose across like the whole city. And I think, that's kind of key to sort of getting us out of this moment as well, to recognizing that it's a challenge and that we all have to work together. So I mentioned that the west and south sides were largely unimpacted by the fire. And so after the disaster, people in those parts of Chicago and took in others who had lost their homes. About 100,000 Chicagoans lost their homes in the fire. That's about a third of the city at the time. And then the industries that were in those parts of the city helped the rest of the city rebuild. And I think, when we're looking at the pandemic and its impact on businesses and schools and even, our own health and well-being, we need that sort of shared sense of purpose once again to get us to the other side.